So good morning, everyone. My name is Paul Flurka. I'm the program representative for this thesis presentation, and we will be listening and watching a presentation prepared by Nick Boychuk. The title is Reading Urbanity, Articulating Toronto Regionalism. The supervisor of this thesis is Professor Marco Polo. The second reader is Professor Masha Etkin. And we also have two guest critiques who are calling in from their office here in Toronto, Jason Fung and Joey Giamo. So Nick, this is prepared. I think it's 20 minutes. So we'll listen to your presentation, watch what you have to show us, and then we will open up the discussions with questions first. Okay, so please begin.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you everybody else for being here. Without further ado, what are the ways in which architecture can communicate meaning? What is the intended message? Who will hear it? And how might they specifically interpret meanings in the built world? These questions arise from semiotic and phenomenological theories applied to architecture. Semiotics studies the symbolism that we read into built form. The meaning of symbols is determined by shared conventions, which are developed and evolved by the society surrounding them. Phenomenology emphasizes the direct experience of dwelling on the earth as a human. It observes that people's interpretation of their environment guides how they build from it, how they gather and concretize that character into built form. These two theories illustrate the contextual nature of meaning. If an architect is to anticipate how their designs will be interpreted, they must learn to speak the symbolic and experiential language of a place and its people. In a pre-industrial and pre-globalized world, the relationship of built form to place is strong because it is derived from the local by necessity. Now, the relationship is much more optional. We often turn to standardized manufacturing, modern technologies, and global trade because of their efficiency and convenience. With these universal forces as the driver of design, the relationship of built form to place can easily become incongruent. Along with the benefits of universalization, Paul Ricoeur identifies an attrition or wearing away at the expense of the cultural resources which have made the great civilizations of the past. This is apparent in the composition of many contemporary cities. Often, urban cores which had long been defined by low-rise residential fabric and an eclecticism of regional styles have become covered in skyscrapers and freeways which feel as though they could exist in any city. Contemporary regionalist architecture aims to address this in the medium of built form. Put most succinctly by Wendell Berry, regionalism is local life aware of itself. It is design born from intimate knowledge of a place. Vincent Cannizzaro holds that regionalism can situate us in the continuity of our individual and shared human history. He stresses that it must foster connectedness to a place and be a response to the needs of local life, not in spite of global concerns and possibilities, but in order to better take advantage of them. This positive relationship between local and global forces is exemplified in critical regionalism, popularized by Kenneth Frampton. Leveraging universal techniques to engage regional characteristics, it holds promise to address the attrition of universalization, not with cynicism or reactionary fear, but with optimism and vitality. With this methodology identified, a question of where to put it into practice remains. In criticisms of regionalist architecture, Keith L. Eggener notes that it tends to relegate itself to the periphery, often only finding success in more rural regions. This has been taken as a challenge, and so Toronto, being a complex and globally connected urbanity, becomes the focus of close regional study and response. The essential property of urbanity, as identified by Christian Norberg Schulz, is that it gathers forms which have their roots in other localities. Gathering context is essential to all architecture. However, when it is practiced at the scale of an urbanity, the direct relation to the natural environment is weakened or almost lost. Natural regional characteristics are shaped and often damaged by what is imported to form a city. Conversely, imported regional characteristics are localized by the realities of their implementation in a new context. With this essential urban dynamic revealed, so too is the path to an urban regional response. Conscious regional architectures can be articulated in urban centers by studying the contemporary and historic states of natural regional characteristics, understanding imported characteristics for their place-specific adaptations, and marrying these with universal techniques. The methodology for the study of Toronto and regional design response is illustrated here. Derived from the thesis statement, it has guided the work since the earliest stages. The first of three research paths asks, how can Toronto's region be defined by natural characteristics? Toronto's street grid expanded from its original 10 blocks in regular fashion, grading and burying creeks as it went. The inverted landscape of Toronto's ravines shaped the city grid in turn, resulting in unique relationships of built form and grid to landscape. Toronto has come to cherish its ravines for their natural beauty, for the biodiversity they support, and for their integral function of channeling stormwater. Regional built form and landscape design is inspired by this unique topography. Critical regional response understands the importance of preserving Toronto's ravines and ecology. It acknowledges that a healthy Carolinian forest and supported flora and fauna are integral to the region, and that the growth of the city and introduction of invasive species has greatly harmed existing ecology. Regional landscape design forgoes harmful vegetation as it understands the importance of native plants to the region. The second research path asks, how have imported characteristics been adapted to Toronto? Toronto's zoning bylaws conserve neighborhood character. A 1966 city document describes the term as private homes situated on attractive tree-lined streets. Housing in old Toronto neighborhoods is effectively frozen by residential zoning categories. Surrounding suburbs are zoned even less dense and with even less type variety. Due to their breadth and zoning color, these suburbs have become known as the Yellow Belt. This, combined with height restrictions, has forced density increase to downtown condos or suburban sprawl. Conservation has become nostalgic. Its inflexibility refuses to tackle the growing unaffordability of Toronto housing. Zoning is far from the only contributing factor, but lightening its grip on the past can provide more strategic opportunities for density increase. A critically regionalist response aims to mediate the preservation of neighborhood character and the need to densify to address housing unaffordability. Research into Toronto's imported characteristics would not be complete without analysis of the city's architectural styles. Prevalent styles have been closely studied from pragmatic, semiotic, and phenomenological perspectives. Much of the city fabric is still defined by English architectural vocabulary. The history of these styles in Toronto is acknowledged by regional response. Georgian, workers' cottages, Victorian Bay and Gables, and Renaissance revival bear a direct connection to Toronto's English colonization. In Toronto's commercial and industrial architecture, a shift away from English import occurred as early as the end of the 19th century. Our Renaissance revival architecture was partially influenced by dialogue with American cities. The prevalence of Richardsonian Romanesque in our low-rise commercial buildings shows a furthering of this dialogue. Of course, the strongest example is found in our commercial style buildings. Though we departed from direct English influence in this capacity, we held on in others. Most homes constructed in the earliest 20th century are overtly inspired by older Victorian Bay and Gables and the English arts and crafts movement. In Toronto, there is still to this day a strong association of private residences with English architectural language. The third and final research path asks, how can universal techniques engage regional characteristics? Case studies are undertaken of architectural projects which achieve a critical dialogue between these two forces. Shim Sutcliffe Architects' 1996 Craven Road House illustrates how regional building typologies and tectonics can be abstracted and reinterpreted with contemporary building techniques. Its distinct volumes reference the Toronto cottage and industrial loft, respectively, through their spatial qualities, materiality, and tectonics. Pat Cow Architects' 1992 Canadian Clay and Glass Gallery shows how materiality can express purpose and connect to historic styles. Structural elements are exposed in dialogue with display pieces. Gallery spaces are naturally lit with glazing positioned to take advantage of local light behavior. Brick veneer is treated as if it were structural masonry, connecting to material history rather than showing off its contemporary nature. Saucier and Perot Architects' 2004 New College Student Residence illustrates the potential for subversive criticality through ahistorical use of material. Its solid upper stories and their misaligned glazing make the veneer nature of the brick obvious. This allows the architects to satisfy the public demand for brick while showing off the building's contemporary nature. Shim Sutcliffe Architects' Ace Hotel echoes the best of the commercial style. A double-height ground floor with generous glazing and curvilinear grand entrance, as well as the regularity of the upper floor's deep-set window modules, which emphasize their verticality, are entirely Sullivan-esque. Custom brick panel veneer and steel accents, both colored a deep orange red, call back to the original Chicago commercial towers and their Torontonian siblings. Shop Architects' 2009 Mulberry House use of custom rippled brick panels achieves an expression which strikes a dialogue with its Richardsonian Romanesque neighbor. The articulation of the panels pays tribute to the decorative brickwork across the street while maintaining a contemporary expression. Bate Shorba Architects' 2018 triple duplex proposal challenges Toronto zoning bylaws, increasing density while remaining attentive to neighborhood character. Its scale and massing are sensitive to surrounding homes, and its spatial configuration is an abstracted reinterpretation of more traditional residential spaces. In parallel to the three research paths, an intensive design exercise puts findings and the thesis argument into practice. The exercise focuses on a site comprised of 4 adjacent lots in the Danforth neighborhood. In replacing 4 existing semi-detached homes, an opportunity is created for more strategic density increase within an established residential area. Various early design experiments on this site homed in on principles which carry through to the intensive design, and these are an external expression of the multi-unit nature of the building, a front mass matching the scale of surrounding homes, secondary mass at the rear abstracting the Toronto rear garage or laneway house, and central sunken green space abstracting a ravine condition. The resultant design is an apartment typology that challenges existing zoning bylaws, yet the density increase is achieved with a scale and street presence in keeping with the existing fabric. The design is composed of 15 units, 3 larger units meant for families, 10 one-bed units meant for bachelors or couples, and 2 one-bed accessible units. The exterior expression aims for a balance of critical reinterpretations of regional architectural elements and a sensitivity and respect for the surrounding context. Most houses in the neighborhood are builders' bay and gable or builders' arts and crafts homes. From the former, the design has adopted a field of dark red brick to clad the main volume, and from both, it has adopted a prominent sloped roof and dormers. The brick is a veneer treatment on wood frame construction instead of traditional masonry. On the northern half of the street-facing elevation, the detailing of the brick and the elements which protrude from or are punched into it treat it as if it were structural masonry. Punched openings are narrow and tall and vertically aligned. 2 bay windows on this elevation are positioned above offset foundations and aligned with dormers above. These individual elements are expressed as one through their alignment and materiality. Red cedar framing and cladding stained 2 ways continuously cover the bay, dormer, and door below, linking them visually and acting as a reference to 1. The surrounding builders' bay windows, constructed of wood with frames of painted wood, aluminum clad wood, or vinyl, expressing themselves as lighter elements hanging off of the brick mass. And 2. The wooden window frames, barging, and ornamentation of Toronto's original bay and gables. The unconventionally aligned north face of the bay elements creates a continuous face which is highlighted by distinct materiality. While it could be argued that Ontario's strong steel trades make it a regional material, the use of weathering steel here is more likely to be read as novel and contemporary due to its absence in the surrounding context. Phenomenologically, its rough texture and coloration are meant to achieve an affinity with the brick veneer, and its reading as metal similarly connects it to the prevalence of other materials in the design, namely the standing seam steel roof, steel panel cladding on the top story, and smaller detail elements such as steel sunshade supports and gates to the rear yard. The positioning of the bay elements along the west elevation is determined by their relationship to internal units and to two existing maple trees in the front of the site. The result ensures that excavation will not be within 2.4 meters of the trees, protecting their roots. This also allows the bay windows to peek between the trees but continue to benefit from their shade. All units are self-contained. Each has access to semi-private exterior space by way of the middle green space, nooks beneath the bay windows, and or their own balconies. Units in the rear building are accessed through the middle green space, while units in the main building are accessed from the street through a shared stairwell. Each has operable windows in living spaces, bedrooms, and bathrooms, allowing for natural ventilation. A 1.2 meter grid guides the entire design, taking note from Frank Lloyd Wright's Usonian homes. Part of reinterpreting the context was imagining how the intimate residential feeling of a Toronto house could be brought to apartment units. To this end, 11 of 15 units are multi-level with internal stairs. 2 of these are shown here, with a single level, one-bed unit above them. The multi-level units take inspiration from the practicality of designs such as Le Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation and Peter Dickinson's skip-stop apartments. 6 one-bed multi-level units comprise the south half of the main building, as shown here. Their mirrored and stacked arrangement ensures that no unit is relegated to a basement-only condition and that they maintain access to 2 exterior aspects. This section cuts through the 2 large family units and jogs through the smaller stacked units to show the continuity of their 2 levels. On the southern half of the exterior, a more even mix of local regional references and universally driven moves are employed. A rectilinear massing reads as contemporary amongst the countless sloped roofs of the surrounding context. The top story is set back and clad in steel panels to lighten up the impact of the overall mass. Punched windows are staggered vertically, but aligned horizontally and connected by recessed wooden paneling, with 2 large windows turning the southwest corner, further breaking up the mass. This visual deconstruction of the corner is inspired by modernist precedents such as Walter Gropius and Adolf Meyer's Fagus factory. On the south elevation, 3 external sunshades extend out in line with window heads. Red cedar shade fins run parallel to steel fins, which are held by steel rods, which are then secured to the wall above. This slim contemporary detail adds to the more apparent use of universal techniques on the southern half of the design. While sunshades are not common in residential Torontonian architecture, they respond to the climatic need for passive cooling in summer and passive heating and access to natural light in winter. Moving to the middle green space. From the street, paths to the rear are blocked by gates. Simple, but enough to mark them as private to anybody passing by. The space is excavated to 1.4 meters below street grade, allowing units in the rear building, as well as those in the basement of the front building, to achieve a walkout condition. This open green area serves as a semi-private shared garden and recreational space for all residents. The sunken quality of this space, its varying points and topographic qualities of access, and the vegetation that it supports are all meant to evoke the character and function of the ravines, which are so integral to Toronto's landscape. Here, the ground is sloped to the north of the site, channeling storm water into a cistern between retaining walls to be pumped to the front yard and or used by residents to grow vegetation. Landscape design moves are taking part in the growing, much needed practice of planting regional vegetation to support pollinators and local fauna. A municipal bylaw has long been used to police native gardens in Toronto, despite the city voicing their support for the practice. A recent legal challenge to the bylaw by Ryerson School of Urban and Regional Planning Graduate Program Director Nina Marie Lister has brought even more attention to the issue. Events like these, combined with decades of warnings on the critical state of Toronto's ecology by informed parties, have done much, but more must still be done. This design humbly takes part in these efforts. Plants are selected for their regional suitability and ability to support pollinators and local fauna, while permeable ground treatments improve stormwater retention. To complement the 2 existing trees on site and provide more shade to the west facade, a silver maple is planted at the south of the front yard. Silver maples grow quite large, quickly, and are very hardy trees, which provide excellent shade. A shared storage room is accessible off the middle green space, and dedicated circulation is provided up to the roof of the rear building. This, combined with the arrangement of simple wooden planters and trellis, provides one more amenity for residents. The roof receives sunlight all day throughout the growing season, meaning it should serve as a quite advantageous gardening space. An initially broad pursuit of meaning in architecture has been focused into meaning for the region and its people. Regionalism as local life aware of itself is an eloquent definition which has anchored the work along the way. Becoming so invested in Toronto as a region has inherently turned designer into that local life and brought awareness of the unique spirit of Toronto, of its growth and trials through its history, and of its contemporary state with all its strengths and challenges, and of the criticality needed to face those challenges and nurture its character. All the awareness gained through regional study has been carefully integrated into this architectural response. There is no way to be certain how the life of Toronto will interpret those embedded meanings, but the uncertainty is welcome. Rather than attempt to dictate a message from on high, it is infinitely more rewarding to humbly take part in Toronto's ever-growing understanding of itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, for the presentation. So now I'd like to invite the panel for questions first, maybe, and then before we move into comments and remarks and discussion. So who would like to start? Please, it's open, so just unmute yourself and jump in.
Thanks for the presentation, Nick. I have a few questions, more for, I guess, for clarity before we get into the discussion. Your intro kind of talks about design that's tailored to both local characteristics and place meaning and growing potential of universal scientific driven techniques. What is this term, universal scientific driven techniques? Is it contemporary design? I mean, I know maybe contemporary design is a little bit more generalized, but I just want your interpretation of what that is.
Sure. It's design strategies, potentials, or technologies which don't owe their creation or development to any particular place. So they've been exported around the world and are practiced in any number of locations.
Oh, and examples of that are shown through your precedents of Shim Sutcliffe's work and Paco's.
So those precedents were selected because, they used certain contemporary building strategies specifically to engage a regional characteristic or characteristics. They would be examples of that, for sure.
Okay. All right. Well, we're so also wondering what was the reasoning for how did you arrive at the sites that you selected? Why these sites? They're a little bit peculiar. I think they're great sites. I'm looking for kind of the rationale for using these.
It was really the study of Toronto zoning bylaws, which showed that there were a lot of opportunities, well, throughout the city for sensitive density increase. And I'm quite familiar with the Danforth neighborhood. So when looking at the city grid, I noticed that a whole bunch of the blocks in this neighborhood had these short sides where it was only 4 or 6 lots. And I felt that if you were to do a more contemporary intervention on that short side, it would be much easier for it to fit in rather than like a very long block edge with 20, 30 lots in a row. Seemed more ripe for a contemporary intervention there.
Okay. And how many units are you proposing?
15.
15. Okay. I know that the existing properties have homes there.
Yes.
Did you consider the existing conditions? Did you assess them before making the decision to propose a new building, a new complex?
It's true that the homes that are there currently are serviceable. There's nothing inherently wrong with them. So the choice of the site was not to say that those homes should be replaced. It was more to say that if, in the future going forward, this neighborhood will eventually have to grow. And so here's how I would do it. More of a hypothetical proposal than saying it's necessary to build in that spot.
Yeah, I think the hypothetical proposal is great, but you've really immersed yourself in the kind of details of design, of very, very specific site-driven design. You've considered a lot of kind of practical issues that I think you've kind of taken on successfully. So it's always difficult with a thesis because a thesis is hypothetical, but how much does how hypothetical can it be based on how much you kind of invested in the kind of background of the project to get to where you are. But anyways, we can save that for later discussion. Thanks, Nick. I don't have any other questions.
Yeah, I had a question about your. Thank you for the presentation. That was great. I think there's real value in the design investigation that you had. I wondered about the methodology of your the precedents that you had. Looking at, maybe you can talk a little bit more, or tell me a little more about how you looked at those Toronto buildings, and then and maybe a little more about how you arrived at those specific precedents afterwards with the Shimsutcliffe, with the clay, the Canadian clay and brick, and those projects. Where how did you go from one to the other? Maybe you could speak more about that.
Sure. So the first part of your question, was that directed at the historical precedents within the city?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So those ones, since I knew partway through I would be dealing with residential, a lot of the historic Toronto precedents were focused on residential, and so that's why there's such a strong connection to the Victorian and Renaissance and Romanesque, and it did start from the birth of the city forward. So I was working from that direction. In time, I could engage more contemporary examples as well, but I felt that those precedents I chose were the most prevalent still within the city. They made up the bulk of the fabric I was dealing with. So that's why I chose those. And then moving to the contemporary precedents like the Shimsutcliffe and Bate Shorba and these and Patcow, they were selected just based on the fact that they achieved the dynamic I was looking for. So it's true, there could have been any number of other choices, and it didn't have to be examples from Toronto. In fact, one was from New York, the Mulberry House by Shop. It was just that they were exemplifying this dynamic of using contemporary building techniques to engage regional characteristics, whatever their region might be.
And that's my next question is, how do you see region? What is your in an urban context, you know, how what are your bounds to region? Like there's location, of course, but there's all sorts of cultural, there's all sorts of ways of defining region. Maybe that's a loaded question, but I'm going to ask
it's
anyway.
A fair question. I asked that many times throughout, and it's true. There's many more characteristics or qualities that I could have engaged beyond, you know, the natural landscape and other natural qualities and built qualities. But I felt that since I'm creating architecture, I would be looking at the built form and the physical world first and foremost. If I was to go further, I could have tried to engage other aspects like cultural practices or artistic qualities of Toronto, maybe. But for the purposes of this thesis, it was focused on the physical, natural, and built world.
But I mean, just to jump in, to help, you had these plans that you were showing around the zoning and the yellow belt and so on. So you were that was actually already the boundaries of the region that you were specifically looking at, or is it not?
Oh no, that's true. It was within the amalgamated boundaries of the city. Right. Although there were certain other aspects that were beyond those boundaries, like the Carolinian forest type or the watersheds and so on. The
natural context, right? Okay. Yes. Are there more questions, or would we like to jump into remarks?
Yeah, I just had I thought Jason's question about like why did you look at these particular styles, I think was a good one, and I was wondering, like, Nick, I think you obviously the ones that you focused on and looked at are the right ones for your project. But did you look at other styles, also very prominent styles like Edwardian, Queen Anne? I mean, the Queen Anne style is kind of considered, the style that is sort of considered the first like residential Toronto style that had most influence. And that also kind of influenced other, subsequent residential styles. Did you look at other ones? I know that obviously the final deliverable is selective, and the selections are great. But did your research kind of was it larger than just the ones that we see here?
There were others that I looked at, but the ones that I've discussed are the ones that I analyzed with the methodology in the full document that I have written out. But yeah, there were others that I read about through architectural history texts. I think the big one was Alex Bozakovic and Patricia McHugh's, I think it's Toronto, a City Guide. So they had overviews of other styles as well. And going forward, I would definitely try to engage more.
Yeah, and that's why I asked, because I noticed that their book informed your kind of very kind of thorough analysis of the ones that you had selected. So I'm curious to see if you had looked at other styles in the same way.
Did you have a chance to go also to the methodology? Did you get a chance to also just when you were forming the grouping of houses, did you look at the renovations that happened to those houses, the how those houses evolved, because that really speaks to the contemporary part of an urban region. So maybe you could speak towards that if you looked at that, or.
So there are a number of homes that I'm aware of in that Danforth neighborhood and in other parts of the city that I think there's two main ways you see them renovated, at least that I identified, which was on the exterior, you'll see, a metal roof be added, or there may be even like brand new projects, which kind of do what I'm doing, where they're using contemporary building techniques to kind of match the aesthetic of the neighborhood. But the other way that I see the existing homes renovated is really just that they're divided up into units for rental. And I guess the other way would be examples like I know Joey. I looked at the Glebe home. I believe that's how you say it, project that you did. So more contemporary interior and well, in that case, interior renovations and renovations of the back of the building where the front street presence is maintained, yet there's a contemporary interior and rear added.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually in your area. It's the East End there, along Glebe Home. And I think Jason brings up a good point. And I think this also kind of goes back to me asking, did you assess the existing? Are there, were there renovations? What's the history of that site? And also kind of the larger neighborhood. And then I think ultimately it comes down to, can your complex accommodate change and more growth and additions and renovations? But I think maybe this is a discussion that we can have now. Can it? Have you thought about that? I know it's maybe not part of the kind of your project's kind of parameters, but I think this is important because I think did you make up the term the builders arts and Bay and Gable builder?
Yeah.
Bay and Gable? Yeah, I love that. I love that you kind of took on, like, you looked at prominent more kind of builder type homes and labeled them in a way that I thought was kind of very appropriate. I thought that was great. But also those homes, and I think the Glebe home example is a very good one. Those homes were very open to kind of accommodating additions and renovations and changing things as new families kind of moved in. Can your project do that?
I see what you're saying. Yeah. Honestly, no, that's not something I looked at. The design was really meant to try to be as efficient as I could with the space that I had, while keeping the units, enjoyable to inhabit. So I think by maximizing that, I didn't really leave much room to add on, unless you were to try to build it up.
Yeah. I mean, you really you did quite a bit of work on really thinking about how the exterior spaces and architecture worked. I think there's opportunity on the inside. I think the kind of spaces that you've created are kind of appropriate for a number of different types of program.
But I think you could consider turning that, how you just said, maybe they can build up or something like that. That's kind of a Toronto condition where you can't, you're stuck with this envelope. And if you want to build a front porch addition, you're going to committee of adjustment kind of thing. Maybe that's a good thing that what you designed here is the owner, if they want to make their 600 square feet feel like 2,500 square feet, they have to find some really creative way internally to do that. Maybe that's part of your narrative, or because expansion is a problem. That's a real problem in the city, and so I consider that as in your rationale.
Jason, when you say it's a problem, do you mean it's a problem because it's such a headache to get through the bureaucracy? Yeah.
I can't tell you how, as you would know, I've broken many clients' dreams by telling them they have to go to committee of adjustment because they want to enclose their front porch or do a rear addition or do a smallest thing.
You go into the committee for everything these days. But I also think that, bureaucracy aside, and I think Nick highlighted this in his study, was that the peculiar, and I'm glad that we're having a discussion of what is Toronto architecture, and how Toronto architecture is not just made up of borrowed English styles, but that Toronto architecture is made up of topography. It's made up of seasons. It's made up of landscape and and certain types of landscape and the influence of the Carolinian forest, but also that it's made up of this kind of weird property shape that we have to deal with. And I know we're sent to the committee of adjustment every time, but also that weird property shape allows us to give our clients that sort of that added space that they need, a kind of more contemporary a contemporary mode of domesticity, whatever that means to them. I think that all these kind of influences that Nick brought up very kind of clearly and very convincingly, these things sort of allow Jason, you and I to kind of operate the way that we do. And I know, we shatter their dreams because they have to wait an extra 4 months and spend $2,000. But the reality is that ultimately, because of that long lot, that they will get that space that they need and that they desire.
Yeah, I think what I was searching for in the thesis was also like that human condition of we want to go beyond what that zoning allows us to do, and that's shown up in the spirit of the urban context of Toronto. It's like how people have creatively, maximized what they want to do on their lot based on so many things, pushing. I for your thesis here, like, you're clearly breaking the zoning bylaw by trying to do something completely different. Maybe you can tell me a little more about your take on, do you see this as, this could be something that could be, throughout Toronto, or is this like, I'll say it right out, the value of this is so good because you're saying, listen, like, we don't need to do, these kind of houses in Toronto. This is another way to do multifamily homes in a Toronto fabric. That's the strength of it. But I don't know if the methodology is fully there. If your design, the final design that you've done, is really a result of this method that you've crafted.
I see. So like the zoning laws that I'm breaking, I guess, would be like the setbacks on the front, because the existing homes that are there are actually quite further back. But because this condition of like the short end block, these lots are adjacent to homes which are facing the other street, so that their sidewall is pushed out much closer to the street face that I'm on. So that was my argument, saying like I can push my building up further. So like all of these short block ends in the East End could have this same treatment, where you gain a lot of space for a building by pushing it closer, and you gain the room for back rear units and middle green space. So I would argue my design is applicable in a number of other locations in the city, maybe not in every Toronto neighborhood.
Yeah, just why the short side? Like, why the short street? Like, we're staring at the elevation here. Toronto is very much this long kind of condition of houses in a row. Mm-hmm. I'm just questioning, like, this site, like why and Joey, you brought it up earlier. Why this site? And maybe talk a little more about this particular place that you chose.
Sure. Maybe I can flip to there. There we go. So yeah, you're right. There is definitely more lots which are part of the longer streetscapes. And yeah, I've basically just chosen the short side because I felt that it was if you did something more contemporary that was breaking zoning bylaws, it would be easier to make that argument on the short side of this the blocks, simply because it wouldn't stick out as much, and it would be easier to make something fit in rather than trying to do my same approach on the long side. That was really the rationale there.
It's just dangerous because okay.
Sorry, if I could just jump in. I mean, one of the things that hasn't really been talked about, but is just emerging now in what Nick said, is that part of what was informing some of these decisions was trying to anticipate and deal with the issue of NIMBYism. And the fact that Toronto is so locked into this particular model, that by starting with somewhat anomalous site conditions, rather than, power into a kind of very consistent block, would make it an easier kind of, an easier first move, right?
Yeah.
and in particular, the great depth of some of these short street conditions, and the fact that the houses are set well back, by bringing the front of the house in alignment with the side of the neighbors, suddenly buys you a whole bunch of, so some of it is very particular, right? Very specific. And some of it is kind of strategic. The idea that if we can start to infiltrate these neighborhoods on these short streets, the thinking was it would be perceived to be less aggressive and less impactful on the fabric. That's part of the discussion, and that hasn't really been talked about, but is just starting to emerge now in this discussion.
Yeah, but Marco, wouldn't it be, if it was truly very regional, then it should fit in pretty well into the fabric of, like, wouldn't it be a stronger argument than to put it in a very typical row? And
I don't think the regionalism argument really. I think the way Nick is framing it, at least, pertains directly to architecture, not necessarily to the kind of larger urban condition or to urban planning. And I think, and I don't know. I don't think regionalism has to be kind of. I think what he's done is amazing. That he's placed critical regionalism within an urban framework. I like that you kind of used Egner's kind of thoughts about the more legible regionalism happens through focused precedents, but they're largely rural. And it reminds me of Elsa Lam, the editor of Canadian Architect. Her thesis focused on this myth of the Canadian wilderness and how contemporary architects have kind of bought into this myth and how they kind of develop their architecture based on it. And she's like, why are we looking at the Canadian and not just architecture, also architectural text? And she's saying, why are we doing this? Why are we looking at the Canadian wilderness? We have major issues in the suburbs. We have problems with housing. We have an urban condition that needs a lot of attention. And that's what we should be focusing on. So I think in that way, Nick, that you kind of, you considered that and you brought your project to the urban condition, I think is the right way to go and to start to address some of these problems. So I'm okay with the site, and I think if it makes it easier for you to make this more kind of convincing to the bureaucracy and to kind of the neighbors around, I think that's okay. But you don't have, this is not a zoning discussion. This is an official plan discussion, right? This is bigger. Jason talks about upsetting his clients. I mean, your clients, well, this is probably going to be a developer, but your clients are going to be spending a lot of money and a lot of time trying to get this approved through, I don't even know what the board is called now. It's not OMB anymore. It's LPAT. It was LPAT, but now it's changed again. What? Yeah. I can't even keep up.
And more legal fees than architects' fees.
Right, more legal fees than architects' fees. That's right. But they'll still complain about the architects' fees. So I think the decision to go here is a good one. I do agree with Jason. I think, Jason, I don't know if you're looking for a prototype. I'm sort of looking for a prototype as well. You're not going to get maybe a perfect prototype with the site that Nick has chosen. But because you're not going to get that prototype, and because this site is a bit peculiar, I think what I was looking for was a less sort of, and maybe this won't work because of the NIMBYism, but a site that the long side of your property has a relationship with, I don't know what it is, like 5 or 6 other properties on both sides. There's an amazing opportunity for real community that extends beyond your 15 units. And for me, like, this is kind of a contemporary way of looking at living in Toronto, and you've kind of set yourself up to do that. So I'm looking for, I know that this is not something that you looked at. That's fine. It's outside of the scope of your project, but I think that's almost something you want to consider if you consider to study this type of model, is what is the relationship with the backyard. It's not just a beautiful brick wall on the property line, it's something else. And it may not have to happen at grade. It can happen at all the levels.
Joey, I think there is an aspect that was kind of not strongly enough emphasized in Nick's work, but was discussed in the theoretical part of his study. And that is, what's the relationship between urbanity and periphery? And I think that what Nick is doing, which is very helpful for the city, he is looking at the periphery within urbanity. He's not going into the outskirt of the city, and he's not getting into the high center of the city with the. He is looking at what he calls, or what is now an acceptable term, smart density.
Mhm.
My question to Nick is, you've decided on the site of 2 lots to develop 15 units. How is that in relationship to the density of the closer to center areas? And I'm not talking about commercial center. I'm still talking about residential intensity of development. And how far do we go when we move further out into the periphery? So this 15 units on 2 urban lots, where does it place your proposal?
Yeah, so it's 15 units on, so 2 semi-detached homes, 4 residences currently, I would say. So it's, you could argue it's tripling, maybe a little bit more than tripling the amount of units. Granted, those units are not as large as a full home, but my goal was basically to at least triple, maybe even quadruple the amount of units on the lots. So that was kind of like the goal I set myself. If it was a suburban condition, I'm sure you could ramp that up even more, since the lots are much wider. And I think the lot sizes that I'm working with they hold for even neighborhoods which are closer to the center, because that old Toronto long narrow lot is quite not standard, but it holds across the old city. So I think the scale of what I'm working with works across old Toronto.
So 1 to 4 is more or less the scale that you're addressing in intensifying the density.
Yes.
Mhm.
I think that's a bit optimistic, just in the sense that, you know, many of these properties over time have been subdivided, right? So even, but let's say you're doubling it. That's already, you know, a huge increase if you start to deploy that on any kind of scale, right? So part of the exercise here is it's kind of it's a more complicated equation than comparing it to the houses that are there now, because those houses could be divided up into units, and that's not an uncommon thing. And you know, this brings us back to the earlier discussion about the alterability of this fabric. Many of these houses, like the existing houses, let's say they're, you know, approaching 100 years in age, they've probably been single family homes, rooming houses, gone back to single family homes, divided into 3 apartments, turned back into 1.5, you know, like they've gone through this over the course of their
Right.
lives.
Yeah.
So I would say that, let's say the 4 houses that are there now, to, you know, in a kind of normal circumstance where people might, you know, add a rental unit and so forth, let's say you get out of those 4 houses 6 to 8 units, right? So you're effectively doubling that. So if you start to think about that happening on the scale, you know, on a much larger scale, and we're not saying that every house in Toronto is going to be converted into this, but if you start to introduce this kind of density in a kind of regular way across the city, you see your numbers, you know, start to skyrocket pretty quickly. A lot of the phenomena that we're looking at now, for example, you know, we're talking about the life cycle of these houses and how they get, you know, transformed over time. increasingly the downtown housing stock is becoming gentrified, right? So houses that maybe started out as large family homes that then became rooming houses, that then maybe got divided up into rental properties. Well, they're increasingly being purchased and re-renovated back for families of 2 or 3. So it's not so much the density of how many units is, but how many people are living in these places. And the truth is that some very large houses in Toronto have 2 or 3 people in them. And so it's not just a question of counting units, it's a question of counting people. And that's a much more difficult thing to control statistically. But you know, the truth is that if you really get to know some of these neighborhoods, a lot of these houses are seriously underoccupied given the amount of area that they provide.
And
But then the next question is, how is that density of people or units or intensity of development, how is that related to open space, and how public is open space and how private is open space? Where is there a concept of a individual backyard, individual front yard, or is it shared living in terms of shared accommodation as outdoors is concerned?
In my experience, the existing homes that get divided up, the divisions are serviceable to live in, but because they're not purpose built, there's a lot of drawbacks. Like, you know, usually the partition walls are not soundproofed, so you've got you know, not great conditions there. And then also usually only one unit, usually the ground unit, gets the access to the backyard, while the upper units only maybe get a balcony or nothing. So part of making my argument attractive was showing that that same idea of dividing up these volumes, if it was done with purpose, each unit can have their own exterior access through balconies or shared green space.
No, that's very true.
Yeah.
I think yeah, a lot has been mentioned already. We have a few more minutes left that we might want to dedicate to final remarks and final comments to wrap it up. Would anyone like to start?
I would like to commend Nick on the board and rather important discussion on semiotics and phenomenology, which superimposed on this international ideas and universal techniques bring the discussion to a higher level of the essence of urban existence. And I think that what Nick did, he brought a very important discussion to a very concrete design exploration. And within this design exploration, he actually not only addressed the contemporary life and the present situation in the city of its diversity and intense density, but he also looked at the significance of local and global, of continuity and history, on materiality and ephemeral quality of space. So from my point of view, it's a good thesis which has broad discussion on a very conceptual level and very specific and addressing very specific, if not level of small detail, the level of important contextual emphasis on materiality and formal representation and semiotics of material and form. So to me, it's a very successful thesis, which from broad comes to from the phenomenology of place, comes to the importance of particular edge or decomposed corner. So I commend you, Nick, on having all of that incorporated in your discussion, and it was a very interesting path.
Thank you, Masha. So maybe Joey or Jason, and leaves the final word for Marco as the supervisor. Anything further to add, Joey or Jason?
Yeah, I want to also commend, I mean, this is, the very fact that this exists is so good for the city. It's, you know, like as a hypothetical project, it has so much value in the conversation of what Toronto could be or what it is. I think for your benefit, you should clarify your methodology of how you arrived at certain things, like the site and things like that. And we discussed it, and there's great rationale. It just needs to be written and talked about. And even the thing of NIMBYism, to me, that's a Toronto regional aspect that we have to really contend with, you know, and it ties into views and things like that from other people's backyards. So yeah, thank you so much. Those are my comments. Yeah.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Jason. Yeah, Joey, do you have?
Yeah, I agree. I think this is a very good and very successful thesis, and a very kind of difficult one to undertake. I think the design is well developed. It's a sensitive insertion into the neighborhood. There's a very good curated selection of case studies to support the design ideas of the thesis. There was going through the document. There's a kind of very nice flow to it. There was a convincing rationale. You know, start with regional theory, selective regional theory, and the selective ideas from that theory. Bring it to kind of Toronto peculiarities, including a well-selected and curated catalog of architectures. You know, bring in our yellow belt problem, and then propose a solution. So there's this very kind of convincing, all the kind of ideas and all the kind of phases of the process. All made sense as it kind of culminated to the final design. Also, I'm glad that, you know, we're having a discussion about Toronto architecture and defining Toronto architecture. It wasn't that long ago when Toronto architecture was sort of seen as a pejorative term. I know this seems weird now, but I have friends who told me that they've been in crits like this and brought up Toronto architecture, and the other critics looking at them saying there's no such thing as Toronto architecture. So obviously that's not true, and it's nice to kind of know that you know, there very much is a Toronto architecture. It's nice to know that it's not just about architecture, that it's also about landscape, and that, you know, we can look at that in a contemporary way and in a more literal way. I think in the way that Nick is showing it, the case studies, or the local case studies, Shim Sutcliffe and Paco, are in some ways, well, maybe not the Ace Hotel, but some of the earlier stuff is, as Marco had pointed out in his article, are more abstract versions. But I think now we're finally comfortable, and we're proud of our built environment and kind of, you know, the influences of it, and we're kind of taking it on. I also admire that you took on critical regionalism. I mean, for me, it felt like, and you know, it felt like largely it's sort of this, not, I don't want to say dated, but it's a kind of idea that we're not talking about anymore. Because, you know, architectural academia goes through, you know, fashions, and critical regionalism is not in fashion anymore. But it doesn't mean it's not important. And I actually think now, where we're at now, with, you know, with the climate crisis and kind of looking at what we need to do with the world, and specifically Toronto, how we have this housing crisis, I think critical regionalism is actually very important. And I'm also finding myself kind of, you know, looking back at some of the older theory books and looking at their ideas and seeing how they can inform design today. I also think that architecture now is sort of lacking real theory to kind of, you know, lean on in order to kind of develop design. I do have, I obviously have a lot of nice things to say. I do have some criticisms about the design, and I think it's more nitpicking. I think we started talking about it earlier about, you know, what's the existing condition? Did you assess the existing condition? Is there value in that existing condition that you could have tapped into and developed a design off of it? I think that would have been maybe in some ways a bit more challenging, because that would be difficult. And I'm not just talking from like, not just thinking about it from the value of heritage, because formally or technically these buildings may not have heritage value, and if they don't, that's fine. But there's also sort of an environmental value to these old buildings that we also have to think about as well. And I'm starting to see that thesis projects and also studio projects are starting to think about that existing condition, whether it's a building on the site or whether it's buildings adjacent to it. So I would have liked to have seen, maybe not necessarily a version of this, but maybe a study just assessing the condition and determining whether or not it was worth pursuing a project with the existing condition or not doing that.
Yes, good. Well, thank you.
Actually, do you mind if I piggyback on that? I know we're finishing.
No,
but,
go ahead.
One thing I also was like I like you had that section of the splits of on the north end, but be careful on your south end. I don't think there is really a strong reason, like that's cut through the north.
Yes.
But when you move to the south of your building, I don't think these splits need to exist. If we look in plan, it could be
Sure.
it could be one, right? There's no reason to, except for the mechanical that you put in the basement, but I mean that could be placed anywhere. So I mean this can be one suite pretty easily, and this could be one suite without splitting them onto
Oh, it is.
like, yeah, that's one suite.
Well, it's they're
not on one level though.
Yeah.
Oh,
So,
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
right. So I mean, just think about. I mean that what you've done largely is great, but that was the one red herring I saw when I was going through your thesis is the layout of that southern portion. Unless you really wanted to do that split for nostalgia of Toronto houses kind of thing.
Yeah, that was the reasoning, but fair point.
Okay. No, thanks for adding, Jason. Thanks, Joey, for your comments. Very good. And Marco, would you like to add?
Sure. I'll just be brief because we've heard a lot. First of all, I just want to say that the intensity and detailed nature of this discussion, I think, is testament to the importance of the work that you've done here, and the level of engagement from our guests, I think, speaks to that. So that's always a great, I think, a sign of a strong piece of work. The whole question of critical regionalism and its currency and so forth, there's times when I think about it, because it's something I've worked with a lot in my sort of critical writing over the years. And sometimes I think it's a horse that we have flogged enough. But I actually think that this shows us that there's still more there, right? It's a question of interpretation, of reinterpretation, of recontextualization. And part of it for me is it's validating in the sense that, a lot of these theories, they kind of come, as Joe said, they kind of come and go out of fashion. But I think their validity doesn't really go away. I think it's our short attention span that's the problem, not the theory itself. And I think you've done a good job of taking this theory, which I think a lot of people would say, that's from the 80s. What are we looking at this for? Well, it's a foundational way of looking at things, and I think that you've done a service to that theory by contextualizing it in this very specific and I think very contemporary way. There's another theoretical context here that we haven't really talked about, not directly at least, but it also is, for many of us, we might think of it as a kind of dated thing. And I'm thinking of Aldo Rossi's Architecture of the City. Mm-hmm. And the reason I bring that up is that his fundamental position is that the real project of architecture is not the individual building, it's the city. And that every intervention in that has to deal with the fabric. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is an example of, a kind of a contemporary update or a contemporary take on how that kind of thinking could apply in the context of Toronto. And one of the great, I think, ironies of Aldo Rossi's influence when he was very influential was that it mostly became formal influence and people made buildings that looked like Rossi, but they never really understood the theory behind them. And I think that this, in a funny kind of way, gets that theory, right? without ever really referring to it. So that's something you might want to learn more about, because I think that your thinking aligns with that quite well. And Rossi is a very systematic and articulate champion of that way of thinking. So I think that that's something else to look at.
That's true.
The other thing I just wanted to say is that, we tend to think of the thesis, or a lot of people think of the thesis as the kind of final project of your time as a student, and it's a kind of capstone. I prefer to think of it as the first project of your life after being a student. And in some instances, we see projects or theses that are really interesting and maybe, really theoretical and hypothetical, but it's hard to see where they're going to go. I think this one is the opposite. I think this one, we can see where it's going to go. And I hope it will go. I hope you will treat this as the first project of whatever it is you want to do with your work as an architect. And because of that, all these things that have come up and said, you should have thought of this, you maybe should have thought of that. Well, I think you will, right? Like this is just that first step. And quite often when I work with thesis students, the first inclination or the first proposal they put forward is it's ridiculously ambitious, right? So often I'll say to them, okay, so this is your PhD, so your master's is going to be the first chapter of that. And I kind of feel like this is the first chapter. So I hope there's a second chapter, and I hope you continue to pursue this, because I think that a lot of the stuff you're hearing from the critics today, who are people who deal with this stuff every day in practice, will shed some light for you on the things you didn't think about and that you would have to think about going forward, and that the next iteration of this will be that much better, and the one after that better still. So I hope that you get the opportunity to actually continue this work beyond the thesis.
Yeah,
Thank you. That's certainly the plan.
Okay, thank you very much, Marco. Yes, and thank you to the whole panel. And I can only underline and subscribe to many things that have been said already, Nick. So congratulations. It's a very successful thesis project. And as Marco said, something that we really can totally in bold letters say this is a thesis project. And thank you very much for your contribution. So I'd like to close the formal presentation now. So Mike, if you would please stop the formal presentation. Okay, thank you. And then Nick, I'd say that the panel comes together for a little bit to discuss your work and the final outcome, and Marco will be in touch with you. Okay.
All right.
Nice seeing you again, Nick.
So Nick, as soon as we're done, I'll send you an email to meet up again on Zoom. Okay.
Yes. And
all right.
So stand by.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, everybody.
We'll hope to see you again soon.